Hello, I'm Mason Cipollini, joined by Colin Brown and Leif Hilding. This is Lab 8 for OPTI 471B.
Before discussing this experiment, we briefly review shear plates. A shear plate creates two laterally displaced copies of a wavefront that interfere, producing fringes that encode the wavefront slope along the shear direction. Here, the shear direction refers to the direction of that lateral displacement between the two wavefront copies. In our setup, the wedged shear plate produces X shear, while the non-wedged plate produces Y shear. We can now relate the fringes directly to aberrations. The wavefront is written as a sum of terms such as defocus, spherical, coma, astigmatism, and tilt. The shear converts these into a phase difference between the two shifted wavefronts. X shear measures variation along X, and Y shear along Y, so different aberrations appear depending on the shear direction. From the fringe spacing and orientation, we can quantify each aberration in units of waves. Now, on to how we first simulated shear plate interferograms using Zmax. The first step in our shear plate simulation is to set up a sequential Zmax session using an AC508-300-A lens from Thorlabs as shown in the first figure above. Next, we convert this sequential setup to a non-sequential setup as shown in the bottom figure. In non-sequential mode, we work with objects instead of surfaces. Set the source Z position, cone angle, and brace settings as shown. Then add an object between the final lens and detector, which is our shear plate, and set the rear Y angle to 0.003 for a wedged plate and 0 for a non-wedged plate. Set the parameters accordingly. At this point, using the NSC shaded model, the shaded model should look like the figure shown with the lens group, shear plate, and detector all visible. Now, in order to ray trace, navigate to the Analyze tab and press Ray Trace. In the GUI that appears, be sure to check Use Polarization. Then, press Clear and Trace and wait for the ray trace to finish. To view the result, open the detector viewer, set Show As to inverse grayscale, and display coherent irradiance. With this setup, adjusting the lens defocus, decenter, or tilt will produce different interferograms, as shown later.
Align the laser with a sliding pinhole and mark the beam location on a screen. Add and adjust the microscope objective until focused before aligning with a spatial filter until all fringes are not visible. Swap the stand for a lens, adjust until retroreflections go into the laser cavity, and repeat with the other lens. Replace the lens with a mirror and a sliding pinhole and adjust the translations and tip tilts until aligned. Assemble the non-wedged shear plate on rotation stage rotated 45 degrees as shown. Once at the best focus position, the fringes will be minimized unless a part isn't ideally aligned. For minimum spherical aberration, add defocus by adjusting the lens Z translation, recording micrometer positions inside and outside the focus. Return to best focus and repeat with right translations instead for decenter. Flip the lens 180 degrees, adjust collimation, and repeat the previous tests for maximum spherical aberration. Flip and adjust the lens back, add the other lens to mirror after the shear plate, rotate the plate 90 degrees, and ensure all is centered with the beam and the mirror is located at the lens's back focal length. Now, use mirror Y translations and the tip tilts for decenter and tilt. Once the fringes are observed individually and together, remove the latter components and replace the non-wedged shear plate with its wedged counterpart as shown, and verify the beam collimation. Finally, repeat the defocus and decenter procedures for both minimum and maximum spherical aberration.
With the setup complete, first is the non-wedged shear plate with minimum SA collimation lens. At best focus, we have a very good null fringe that matches the simulation. There is some slight residual spherical aberration that is clearer in the next measurements. Now we add defocus as a Z offset in the collimation lens, positive being outside focus. As defocus is added, increasing vertical fringes are seen in the interferogram. We see the fringe spacing for a given defocus does not align with the simulated results, primarily due to a smaller shear plate in the experiment compared to the simulation. Next is decenter of the collimation lens, and we see the fringes are less sensitive to defocus. One issue we had was clipping at the shear plate due to the off-axis effect of decenter. At our extreme of 15 mm, just over one full fringe is visible, which occurs at 5 mm in the Zmax, due to the clipping and shear plate size difference. The interferogram is an off-center cropping of the typical Y shear coma pattern due to the off-axis field introduced. Flipping the collimation lens for worse spherical aberration, we see a cropped-in version of the simulated results, both showing the higher amount of spherical aberration. Looking at defocus, we see fairly clean fringes with a barrel shape outside focus and a kind of double eye inside, with fringe count increasing the further from best focus. Our experimental data at -4 mm matches well with a cropped region of the simulated -4.5 mm. Looking at decenter along Y, here our results are not quite as clean. However, we do get the expected off-center coma that was seen previously, with aberration increasing the further off-center we go. This case was not part of the simulation. Overall, for the worst-case SA orientation, all observed patterns are similar but with more spherical aberration. Next, the system is configured to measure the test mirror. At best focus, we see very large spherical aberration, primarily introduced from the focusing lens. Moving through focus, we see similar patterns to the worst SA collimation lens, but less occluded, letting us see much more of the interferogram. While there is no simulation setup for the mirror, the defocus pattern looks very similar to the worst-case collimation lens defocus. Now we add X and Y tilt separately, then both at once with defocus added. The system responds to both tilt directions with coma, however it is more sensitive to Y tilt. The pattern seen is the expected coma plus spherical. Finally, defocus is added and we see a combination of all three aberrations. Next we return to the least SA collimated beam setup with a wedged shear plate. At best focus, we see linearly spaced horizontal fringes, and defocus results in a condensing and tilting of the fringe pattern. We see the shear plate in our setup is less sensitive than the simulated one, which can be explained by a larger wedge angle. Additionally, we see more residual spherical aberration matching the non-wedge shear plate results. Looking at decenter, the wedge shear plate is much less sensitive to Y decenter than X decenter, shown in both the experimental and simulated data. Finally, the collimation lens is oriented for max SA and the measurements repeated. In the interferogram, we see more spherical aberration as a stronger S-shaped curve, but with the same effects of fringe rotation caused by defocus. The SA in the simulation appears more pronounced and is again likely due to a larger shear plate aperture. Lastly, we look at decenter. Experimentally, we again see the fringe orientation is more sensitive to X decenter, however in the theoretical it is harder to make out the changes in slope. However, you can see the interferogram clipping the window in the same ways for experimental and simulation. Overall, the wedge shear interferograms are much harder to read compared to the non-wedge shear plate, showing the disadvantage of the wedged.
For our quantitative analysis, we chose to analyze our interferogram captured using the mirror with the collimating lens oriented for minimum spherical aberration with -1 mm of defocus. The result of counting fringes is shown in the figure. Using Wien's least squares fit method, we obtain the wavefront difference, total wavefront, and tilt subtracted wavefront on the left, along with the magnitude of each aberration in waves on the right. The results show roughly twice as much negative defocus as spherical aberration, significant tilt, and negligible coma, which is consistent with the interferogram.